How did you get into fashion and costume design?
Well, I studied fashion design in London, and I enjoyed it so much that I studied the history of fashion, which in the end is costume designing. And then when I moved to America, I started working in television and film, and then I got into costume designing, which I actually prefer than fashion. Fashion, you have, is generally your point of view. It's what your vision is, it's what you want to do. It's also a very solitary way of working. While costume design, you're designing for a film. The film is someone else's vision. You usually work with the director. And then it could be period. There's so much more to it. You could be doing a period film that's set in the 1800s or the 1900s, the 1920s, different places. So to me, it's just a little bit more that you can do with it rather than fashion. You're told a certain color that you should be using that year, and it's just a little bit more structured.
Was Bolden your first lead costume designer?
Yes, it was.
Feature film?
Yes, it was.
How did you secure that opportunity?
Well, that was actually very interesting. I was in London when I was called for Bolden, and my father was a huge fan of Louis Armstrong. So when I got called to do an independent film in North Carolina, I was a little okay. But then they told me the title, which was Bolden. And I was like, as in Buddy Bolden, and I came over. I was actually supposed to be the shop supervisor stroke assistant designer. But then they realized my knowledge of fabrics, costumes, of New Orleans of that time, and I got hired and replaced the designer. I knew the name because my dad saw Louis Armstrong in an interview, and he said Buddy Bolden was the reason why he became a musician. But I came here, no one knew the name. So we talked, I tried to find him, I didn't until the film, and that's where I learned so much more about Buddy Bolden. I mean, he invented jazz, and no one knows his name. And for me, I know there are so many untold stories, whether they're African American or West Indian or Euro-African. And the fact that even us as Black people didn't know his name, and to be a part of that process of getting him out there and learning about his story and learning how tragic his ending was, I thought it was a very, very important story to be told.
So the film is set in the early 1900s in New Orleans.
Yes.
You were born in London, but you say you know a lot about New Orleans.
Yes.
What did you use to draw inspiration for some of these costumes?
Funnily enough, what I used was, because I knew New Orleans and especially where it was set in New Orleans at that time, my thought process went to Jamaica, the 70s Trench Town, because that would have been the equivalent of that, the music, because that was when Bob Marley was coming out and just the new era of that music. And I used that as a catalyst for me to realize it was their only sense of freedom. So that day, that Saturday night or that Sunday night when they were going out and partying would have been that moment of freedom. During the week, it was not long after slavery ended. There was no money. They were still literally fighting for their freedom because it was just before Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to make sure that the club scenes especially were vibrant, were bright, because we're the same people we are today as we were then. We love to go out, we love to dress up when we go out. So I had to make sure that was a part of the scene.
How would you say, in watching the film, when you saw it, because when you do filming and you're shooting different scenes and everything's out of whack, once you saw everything put together, the cinematography, how did you feel about your costume choices?
I felt good. But again, Dan he had such a clear vision. So when he came to you and told you what he wanted for this scene and what he wanted for that scene, it didn't really change. They might have changed some parts artistically, but also the production design was so beautiful. So I got to work with the production designer a lot to see the space. We knew how it was going to be lit, so I would choose colors on how it would be lit and the colors. And sometimes when the light hits the colors, it changes according to it's bouncing off. So I was lucky enough that the costumes were never going to be too expensive, apart from a few characters, so we used a lot of cottons. And cottons are great to dye. You can dye them down, dye them up. You can really change and do what you want with them. So I was basically able to get the exact colors that I wanted for the scenes. So when I saw it in film, I was really happy with that. I was really happy with that because, again, the cinematography was just amazing. And then when you get the music with it, it was unbelievable. Because the great thing is some of the first scenes we shot were the club scenes. So we got to hear the music. And we heard the music for months before we shot because the guys were rehearsing. So we knew what was coming. And that was a big part of how I chose the fabrics, how the girls were going to look, was the music. The music for me is it was John Cornick, one of the producers, that said it best. It was the other character throughout the film. Because it really is about Wynton's music. So everything followed that. And for me, I would say I saw the music. So I was able to design from what I saw of the music. And it just, thankfully, came together well.
So when people watch this movie, what is one message that you want them to take away from the movie as a whole or from the clothing that?
From the movie, no, Buddy Bolden. Appreciate jazz. I think we don't appreciate jazz enough. And I find I love a lot of jazz music. And I find when I go to even jazz at Lincoln Center, Wynton Marsalis is the house band. And when I go, there's not enough black people in the crowd. And I'd like us to appreciate what everybody else appreciates. I grew up in Europe. They love jazz there. It's the reason why all the jazz musicians of the 60s and the 70s moved there, and the 50s when they couldn't survive here. And we don't appreciate it enough. I've lived here for 25 years, so I've learned so much more about African American culture. It's so rich. Our culture is rich. We don't appreciate what we have. And that's why it's taken. And we only realize it after the fact. We need to appreciate it now. And I do love what is going on in the arts today with what happened with Ruth Carter. That was, you'd have thought I won. I love that we are now able to tell the stories. Not just the stories are told and we are not a part of it. You know, you had Ryan directing, you had Ruth telling the story, and I can't remember the name of the production designer. But that is happening more and more now. And we need to appreciate that, and we need to be supported in the arts so it happens more and more. Not just Black Panther, but films like these about us. We need to recognize it and not wait for it to be told by someone else. Because we were lucky that Dan saw this story and wanted to tell it. And we need to do this more, because can you imagine the amount of untold stories that are out there that are like Buddy Bolden? We need to tell them. That's what I'd like people to take from this. Pay attention to our history. It's glorious.